Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm checking in on my oldest red wiggler bin. And the one that I'm talking about is the one that's right back here behind the board. The board that I'm holding in front of the camera provides a little bit of detail about what's inside the bin. It's red wigglers, red wiggler worms, and the bin itself is 131 days of age at this point. And it's been 35 days, so basically 5 weeks since I last fed this bin. And up until that point, it had received 13 feedings. And it was after that I decided that the material was starting to look pretty good. I wanted to try to start steering it towards harvest. So I stopped feeding it 35 days ago. And between then and now, I've been checking in periodically. And I've even gone so far during my most recent few visits as to remove bits and pieces of larger chunks of material in here that was not yet broken down. So I figured, since it's been a week now since we last checked in on it, I thought we would get it up on the bench and see how things are progressing. Last time we were in here, we did pull out some stuff, some larger chunks of leaves and things that looked like they were taking a little bit longer to break down and that they might hamper us getting to the finish line. So the whole idea there was to really let the worms focus on the really minuscule little bits and pieces of, bedding and food scraps that remain in the bin. So I'm really curious to see how things are coming along. And if it does look like, they've pretty much done away with all the little tiny minuscule bits and pieces of stuff in here, then we're going to set this thing up to try migrating the worms out of the finished compost. So let's get this thing up onto the bench and see how things are coming along. Now, one thing you'll notice if you've been following the progress of this bin is that I place these cardboard coverings on here because it's something that I like to do usually in my bins, because it does seem like it encourages the worms to hang out right beneath the plastic, because the cardboard here is providing darkness. Because, this is translucent plastic, so during the daytime I was thinking that maybe it gets a little bit bright out here. Yeah, although there's no lights going on in my wormery. And then I guess the side effect is that there's worms hanging out right here on the surface, hanging out. They're all there to greet us when we open up the bin, and it's fun and everything like that. But in hindsight, it got me to thinking, hey, all these worms should be down in the bin working down the materials, not hanging out up here enjoying the moisture. So it almost makes me think that having that cardboard on top is a little bit of a detriment, because all these worms could actually be down in the bin working down the materials rather than taking a little holiday up here and just sucking in the moisture that's collecting. So one idea here was to maybe not put those cardboard coverings back on. It just seemed like a good idea. At some point I had that cardboard in my hand. I noticed that this one bin didn't have a covering, and that the plastic was possibly letting light in, and that the worms might be deterred from hanging out on the top. And then in hindsight, it made me wonder, hey, maybe I would have been better off not having the worms hanging out on the top surface there. So maybe after the fact, once we put the plastic on, we'll leave it at that, and maybe by there being a little bit more light flowing in through that translucent plastic, we'll have fewer worms on top of the paper and more worms down in the bed doing their job. So the material looks really nice. There's a nice kind of even coating of fresh castings scattered across the top, but there's also still clear evidence that the job isn't done. And if that was right there in my hand, all these little bits and pieces were the measure of success, then I think we'd already be able to tell right away that we've not yet reached our goal of having the worms fully break down all of the compostable materials in this bin yet, as well as the little sticks and stems. And then maybe we would be done and we just cover up and call it a day. But I don't think we're going to do that. I think we're going to pick around and see how things look elsewhere within the bin. And I guess I'd always have the option to do what I did last time too, which is every time I find a little scrap like this, which is to just collect it up and maybe extract it. And then by, reducing the amount of work the worms have to do to get this bin to the finish line, we might get there quicker. I mean, do I really want to bother? It always seemed to me like, you know, a small amount of little leaf scraps and bedding bits would be something that the worms should do away with pretty quickly, especially considering that this bin has not been given any fresh food in so long. So that's part of the reason I'm a little bit surprised every time we come in here that we find all kinds of chunks of leaves and bedding and everything in here still. And I know no matter how, you know, thoroughly I go through this and pick the pieces out and remove them, I know that I'm leaving a whole lot more in there for the worms to take care of. So maybe we'll just do it for the heck of it, since we're kind of encountering the stuff anyway. Let's pull it out. I can always dump it into one of my newer worm bins where it can get the attention that it needs and the time that it needs to break down thoroughly. And it'll give us a little edge on maybe getting to the point where we could start trying to coax the worms out of this material so that we can harvest it. I'm definitely sensing a little bit of movement within the material, like the springtail type movement. So when I push a little bit of the material aside, I can see it sort of shimmering and moving ever so slightly. To me, that seems like it's springtails cruising around, because the moisture in here is pretty good. There's a pretty damp environment in here that the worms, I think, would probably appreciate if it continues to stay that way. It'll just be at the end usually when I try to encourage a little bit more drying of the material so that the worms are even more inspired to move out of it, you know, not only for the absence of food, but also at that point because of the steady drying of the material. Making the material less and less habitable for them doesn't really make it uncomfortable for them per se, I don't think. But I think they do recognize the fact that they could probably find more damp, more comfortable places if they just go looking for it. So yeah, I'm starting to accumulate a pretty good pile of little bits and pieces over here, and we've not even gone very far in terms of looking through the stuff. When we kind of excavated the middle section, and the middle section is where I've always fed, and you know, you might think that that's the place where we're going to find the greatest number of stuff, but this bin has been agitated quite a bit. I've moved things around and shuffled things around quite a bit in this bin. So I don't think anything is where it was originally placed in terms of food or bedding. I think, you know, looking pretty much anywhere, we're probably going to find a pretty even disbursement of bits and pieces of this and that in here. But I mean, some of these chunks of leaves are pretty good sized. And, you know, if I'm not mistaken, I think this bin might have gotten a little bit damp at some point. So I did try to use a lot of dry leaves as sort of a medium to soak up some of the moisture. And I think by doing so kind of late in the game, I sort of predestined this bin to have to deal with all those little bits and pieces of leaves to be broken down. And then I think I also opted to take a whole bunch of autumn leaves. I took a whole bunch of really pretty looking autumn leaves to dress up the bins to make them look pretty, you know, with all the different autumn colors, the oranges and yellows and reds and everything. And I laid those into my bins thinking that it would look really nifty, and it did. So in the short term it looked kind of cool. So it was eye candy, if you will. But there too, all those large, hardly broken down leaves translated into a bunch of material in the bin, which was going to require a great deal of time for the worms to break down. So I've used all of that, all those experiences as an opportunity to kind of have some lessons learned. So I've kind of come to the determination that if I'm going to use leaves in my bins, then I would probably use them in only my newer bins where there's ample time for the leaves to break down. But I think more importantly, the little sticks and stems of the leaves. So I don't think this is really a leaf stem right here. This is really more of a little stick. But most of these little thin, little stick-like objects that we see in here are mostly just the stems of leaves. Because I do use a fair bit of leaves in my bedding and in my feedings usually. But more recently I've been withholding the use of leaves in my older bins. I don't have a problem putting it into newer bins where I know there's going to be a good amount of time for things to break down. But in the older bins I've been trying to hold off on doing so, because otherwise you end up with these large chunks of leaves, mainly the leaf stems, which are going to take a long time to break down. And I'd hate to think that, you know, because of just a couple chunks of material like that, that we're going to be unable to harvest the bin. And there too, there's always a way around an obstacle, right? You don't want to think there's only one way to skin a cat. The other option would be to use sort of the harvesting method where you run the worms down into the bed using bright lights overhead, and then use a screen to sift out any large lingering objects within the finished compost that you don't want, such as, you know, objects that are not yet broken down. That's certainly an option. And if I wanted to steer towards that, then I could maybe start right away, allowing the bin to dry off, and try to have some material in this bin which is light and flaky and easy to sift. But I've been steering more towards using the method where the worms separate themselves from the castings by simply moving out. So that's the reason I've been doing it this way. I've been trying to steer towards the point where the material is pretty much devoid of any materials that the worms would consider nourishing. And it would be at that point that they'd be, you know, looking around for a fresh source of food. And then I'd be able to just set up one edge of the bin with a nice spot where there's a whole bunch of fresh food and bedding and everything for them to be lured into. And then they would basically abandon the finished compost all on their own. But if I really want to follow through in that manner, then I really need to see that all the things that would prevent them from leaving, such as scraps of food, have either all been eaten or removed. So I'm almost wondering if it would make good sense at this point just to decide to harvest this bin using the light method. Drive the worms down into the bedding, sift the material, pick out all this stuff during harvest, and be done with it that way. So if I was really going to take that route, then the next step I think would be to allow the bin to dry off a little bit more rather than keeping things nice and damp and cozy for the worms. So I mean, there again, it's taking all the next steps to support your objective and your game plan. So this would be an opportunity for us to say, yeah, we're switching gears. We're going to not try to migrate the worms out of the material using a horizontal migration method, but instead we're going to plan on separating worms from castings using the light separation method and screening of the material. And if that were the case, then now would be the time to leave the material uncovered, or at least not covered with plastic, so that it can start drying out, which would make it a lot easier to screen the material. Because as long as stuff is a little bit damp like this and it clumps together, it's not going to want to run through the screen very easily. So, you know, I always kind of hate the idea of backpedaling on a game plan. I'd almost rather just see it through and learn from the experience of getting to the finish line, and you know, recognize the missteps and the opportunities for improvement. So I think I'm just going to continue on with this. Naturally, what we're doing here in the process of picking through and just chit-chatting, we are extracting a lot of those things that are going to deter the worms from wanting to leave the material. All of this stuff that's piling up here in the corner is all stuff that would be, you know, viable nourishment for the worms to take advantage of going forward. And with that stuff floating around in the bin, the worms aren't really going to be very motivated to exit the castings. So I think we are just going to be extracting this pile of material here. We've already gone through about 2/3 of the bin, so there's not much left. So I think I'm just going to follow through with this sort of inspection / extraction. And I've been doing this extraction bit on this bin for a couple check-ins now. We did something very similar to this last time we checked in on this bin a week ago. So why not just keep following through with what we started? Everywhere we look, there is a good amount of worms, that's for sure. This is definitely a busy bin. Plenty of worms hanging out in here. And that's one of the main reasons I keep thinking that just pressing on with this game plan should work, because there are a good number of mouths to feed in here. And it just doesn't seem like a whole lot of material that the worms need to polish off anymore. It just seems like there's a fairly minimal amount of small scraps of this and that in here. And I think that was the thinking too, was just, hey, you know, how much can it be? Let's leave them just to go about doing away with it on their own, at their own pace. But what the heck? If we can pull some of it out, then I think we'll end up speeding things along here. Because I think everyone kind of gets the idea of how this is, attempting to be done. But if we could, do little things to help it, then why not? And ultimately, to me, this is almost like, I don't know, relaxing, basically. I do enjoy picking through the bin. I enjoy checking out the worms. I enjoy checking out the compost. And it does kind of feel productive, because it does feel like I'm helping drive the process to completion. And while, I feel like I could have potentially, taken measures early on to not add stuff that I would have to pick out later, that's fine too, because I feel like I'm learning along the way and, equipping myself to make better decisions in the future. So, yeah, I think we're probably going to see an opportunity soon in this bin for us to switch from the foraging mode, which is where we're at now, into the mode of trying to migrate the worms out of the castings into a common feeding area on one edge of the bin where we can start extracting them and relocating them. But for now, it does seem like we're just going to have to continue with this foraging process for a little bit longer. Even though we're 5 weeks into it, it's certainly not done. There's still a good bit of material that the worms need to polish off before we can consider this as just a bin full of finished castings. And there again, it depends on what you're after. There's certainly no reason why you wouldn't be able to just use this stuff as is, because a little bit of organic matter within your castings is just fine. Because there's certainly nothing wrong with having material like this scattered throughout your vermicompost, because organic material within your mix, your potting mix or your potting soil, or the vermicasts as it is just going into your garden as a top dressing or whatever, that's all good stuff too. That's all going to support the life that lives within the material, so that it can continue on and have some sort of a form of nourishment. Material that can just continue breaking down over time. So, if you're looking to sell this stuff commercially, you would probably not want to have a whole bunch of leaf scraps floating around within it, because then your customers would say, hey, why are you selling me vermicompost that's littered with leaves? But if it's for personal use, the way it is for me, if it's just stuff that's going to end up in the garden anyway, then there's certainly no reason you wouldn't be able to use it as is, just the way it is right here. But you would still be faced with the challenge of needing to extract the worms somehow, and that would have to be done either through light harvesting, or if you were to initiate an attempt at migrating the worms out and kind of letting them abandon the material on their own, there too the process could be hampered by the fact that the worms would still feel like they're inhabiting material that's got a fair bit of remaining food left in it, and that there's really no reason to leave. And at that point, you know, maybe drying of the material would be the only motivator that you would have on your side, as well as the food that you're trying to lure them with. So, you know, there's a number of different variables to take into consideration when you're planning the next steps and, you know, judging whether or not those variables are favorable or variables that are potentially going to, you know, slow things down for you. So I think the same way as last time we did this, you know, there has to be a point where you just decide that you're going to stop, because you could just go on and on picking through this stuff, I'm sure, for hours and continuing to pull little bits and pieces out of it. But that wasn't really my goal today. My goal was really just to, you know, figure out where we stand and, you know, do what we did right here, which is to help it along a little bit if we can. And we even explored the option of maybe, you know, switching gears and handling the separation of the worms from these castings in a different way, if we really felt like we wanted to do that. But I think we're just going to press on. After 5 weeks, we're getting there, but we're certainly not there yet. So I think soon, though, I think pretty soon we're going to be able to look through this material and consider it as being more or less finished, and then we can start trying to gear up the worms for their migration out of the material by setting up a horizontal migration for them. So let me go ahead and scoop all of this uneaten stuff out of here. And I'm going to place it into one of my active bins right here behind me on the shelf. Try to do so in a way that I don't drop any of it all over the floor and make a mess. Okay. Alrighty. And then I'm going to level things off here. Here again, it's always like right now during the leveling off process that I always find a nice big chunk that I wish I had extracted. But I need to just stop. I need to know when to call it quits. As much fun as it is to pick around through the bin, I do believe I've accomplished today's mission, which was to check in, see how things are doing, try to make a determination as to how close we are to the point where we might be able to initiate migration, and I think we're close. But I also believe we're that much closer by having extracted a bunch of the materials that were going to prevent us from getting to that stage. So we've helped the process out a little bit too by what we've done here today. So let's get things covered back up here carefully, I think, because this piece of paper that I've been using to cover things up here is very tattered at this point. It does seem like if you just handle it a little bit incorrectly, it's just going to fall to pieces. And here too, it almost seems like by putting this in the bin, we're giving the worms a whole bunch more food to eat. Look at the edges of this thing. They've completely shredded it. So I also kind of have wondered if you know, having this in here is potentially another thing that's preventing us from getting to the finish line, because this in itself is just a large chunk of food, basically. So geez, what do we do? Do we exclude that too? It's very tempting to do so. And it does feel like if we do, then there's one other large item that we're taking out of the mix that's probably doing a great deal in terms of distracting the worms from focusing on the material down in the bed. So you know what? I think I'm going to do just that. I'm going to take this out too. It'll be funny if all along this is the one thing that's really been shooting me in the foot and preventing me from making better progress. But yeah, I think by removing this, we're also going to do ourselves a big favor. I do have a bin that I consider to be probably my most active and most densely populated red wiggler bin. So I've taken all those things that we took out of here and placed it into that bin. It's a pretty good sized bin, and it does seem to make pretty good progress on almost anything I put in there. So I'm assuming that stuff is going to break down quite nicely and quickly in there. So what have we done here? We've extracted a whole bunch of stuff that's probably distracting the worms from focusing on all the little stuff that we want them to be working on. And that also includes a fairly large piece of paper that was resting on the top that was probably being used as food at this point. And we're also going to skip putting this out here, although now it doesn't matter anymore, because if they want to hang out on the top, then let them, because it'll be nice and dark and comfortable for them to do so with this being here, at least during the daytime hours. At night it's nice and dark in here, but I would think any daylight coming in through the windows might, you know, cause the worms to feel like it's a little too bright for them and they'd rather not be there. And then those areas might get a little bit neglected. But everything under here is going to stay dark 24 hours a day, allowing them to nibble off any little scraps that might be out on the surface too. So this, I think, helps optimize the situation even more. And we do so every time, just optimize a little bit more each time. Try to help things a little bit if we can, to try to reach our goals. But after 5 weeks, I would like to think that we're getting close and we can probably initiate the migration of these worms soon. So maybe another week from now we'll check in and find that the material in the bin is in fact now almost all castings, and that we can start initiating the migration of the worms out of the material so we can harvest. So let's keep our fingers crossed. Hopefully we'll get to that point maybe in another week or so. So that's it for today, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Bye now.